started, I was asked to talk to you about research integrity and the responsible conduct of research. Um, and I just want to give this with a primer that I've done a lot of bioethics and ethics teaching, but most of this is stuff that comes from practice. So from the time that I was training about 25 years ago, and it was a requirement as part of my NIH-funded program, when I was doing my PhD in the US, there was a requirement that we were aware of all of the ethical constraints and requirements of biomedical research. To the work that we do at our Han University, it's ethical conduct of research has been kind of a theme that has run throughout. So I want to talk a little bit about research integrity. And this is where it's particularly useful if I can see faces or if somebody wants to chime in. But when we talk about ethical conduct in research, I want to be able to link that or to ask the question really from the audience about why we think that's so important. So if there's anyone who'd be willing to unmute and just throw out why we think that ethical conduct in research, and what do we even mean by that?
I could try pitch again, Dr. Kulsoom.
Please go ahead.
I suppose the ethical conduct, sorry, it's in alignment with the standards that have been put forth ever since the misconduct had occurred in research, and different groups and bodies, they sort of united in order to protect the welfare of patients as well as society at the end of it. So I would say that's something according to those lines.
So thank you, Rua. I think that's a good historical perspective to why it's important to have ethical conduct of research. If we were to, for a second, put that aside, there were atrocities that have been committed, let's say during the Second World War, and even before that, that have led to the development of particular guidelines. But if we were to put our blinders on for a second and just think about why do we think that in research particularly, certainly in patient care and stuff, we're very aware of why it would be important. But in research, and what specifically do you guys think constitutes ethical conduct? And I don't mean to put Rua on the spot, so anybody's happy wants to answer that, please do.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm Sidra.
Sidra, please go ahead.
Since there's a lot of policy making based on the research and the results we have after the research, so it's important that the research is done ethically in order to avoid any consequences which may be due to the unethical practices, because it's going to impact the impact of the research is going to be exponential when it's applied.
Okay, yes, absolutely. Let's talk for a second about values. What values do you think are going to be important when we say ethical conduct in research? And I want you guys to think about what values are just important even in everyday life. And then let's see if those matter in research.
I think it's integrity.
Okay, great. Integrity in what? Actions, thoughts, words?
I think it applies to everything.
So all of them. So by integrity, we mean really do the right thing, do what you mean, say what you mean, and uphold that concept even in research, right? Just like you would expect to do it in regular life. Sorry, excuse me. I want to make the argument that there is a requirement for this ethical conduct in research, and you guys are absolutely right. It is about integrity in actions across the board, whether it is in thought or conduct or writing or presentation. And it's particularly important because there is research does not happen in a vacuum. Research happens because we build upon the work that has been done in the past. We look to the literature to describe research questions and identify research questions. And we build upon the work of others, just like we hope that people will build upon the work that we have done with a common goal in mind. And the common goal being, in our case, especially if we do research that is biomedical research or research related to healthcare, it is for the greater good of patients or patients. So if we start at the bottom of this list, I'd like to argue and hopefully convince you guys that acting with integrity in all aspects of research is an obligation then that we owe to society. And I think this is what Sidra, you were alluding to, that when we are or when research may inform things like public policy or practice, and society is turning to the scientific field and to researchers to help determine through evidence what is good for the health and well-being of, again, individuals and populations. So then we owe it to society to ensure that all our actions are meaningful and truthful. And that there is nothing in research that may be considered false. In many cases, not always in places like Pakistan, but in many parts of the world, people through their tax dollars and the money that they pay in taxes actually fund research. So there's a fiduciary responsibility as well, in addition to the moral responsibility. So you can imagine things like COVID, where if the research community or the scientific community was not working and providing evidence-based information, what might have happened with the vaccinations and the ability or the willingness of individuals to be vaccinated, and how that could have emerged as a public health crisis if there was any kind of mistrust or distrust between science and society. The other obligation that we have, because science and research does not happen in a vacuum, is from one researcher to the other. So working within a particular field, we rely on the work of others to garner methodologies that may have worked, to identify previous data and information on which we hope to build, to support the evidence that we are generating or gathering, and in general, driving a body of literature that can, again, be meaningful for the individual health or for the well-being of populations. And if there is any mistrust, and there are examples, particularly if I turn to the neuroscience field, I don't know how many of you are familiar with them, but there's been a whole case study on the mistrust that has emerged around the amyloid beta hypothesis in the etiology of Alzheimer's disease. And this comes from one somewhat rogue researcher, I suppose, who may have falsified and fabricated some of the data, on which literally billions of dollars of future grant funding was provided to him and many others. And it has really kind of, when we're on the precipice of getting things like monoclonal antibodies and other things into clinical trials, it's really kind of muddied the waters and dirtied that field. And if anybody wants, I'm happy to kind of share an article on that, particularly because it's relevant to neurosciences. So that's why we owe it from one researcher to the other to have ethical conduct, so that we can trust each other. And this is an obligation that we have to one another, so we can build upon each other's work without any doubt. But what I really want to leave you guys with, and we'll talk for the next half hour or so, but if there's nothing else that you take away from this session, I want all of you to consider the obligation that you all may have as researchers to uphold research integrity, and that obligation is to yourself. So not because somebody is going to find out, not because there might be any penalties for any wrongdoing, but in recognizing that we have this obligation to society, to the research community, that first and foremost, that obligation is to ourselves, to be able to, and I think another way of putting this is that your conscience is always cleared. When you go to bed at night, you do so with a clear conscience that whatever work you have done that day is upholding the highest tenets of research integrity. And that's when nobody's watching, right? So that really is the most important thing that we would want, is that we uphold that obligation to ourselves, and the others trust us because of the kind of work that we put out, and because it is, of course, always upholding the tenets of research integrity. So I want to take you guys through, and by the way, again, because of the way that my screen is structured, I can't see if hands go up immediately. Please feel free to just unmute and stop and ask me a question if you need to, or you want to share something or your viewpoint. I'm happy to take it. But I do want to then move on and talk about some terminologies that are important when we talk about research integrity and responsible conduct of research. And really, we could unpack each of these. And when I do it with our graduate students and PhD students, we spend many hours of a core course doing it. But essentially, what we're interested in, and we all want to subscribe to, is this idea of the highest standard or the highest ethical principles in the context of research, which is the scientific standard, and that is otherwise known as RCR, or the responsible conduct of research. What that means is that it's the application of ethical principles in the context of research. These are ideal standard institutions that individuals and institutions endeavor to meet. And there are some industry standards, so to speak, that we'll talk about, but many institutions and many disciplines of research will also set standards. So case in point, how we do authorship in biological and clinical sciences and medical science and research is slightly different from the way they do it in social sciences. So these kinds of ideals may vary from discipline to discipline, but essentially what we're upholding are the scientific standard, or what we want to achieve is a responsible conduct of research. On the flip side, then, is on the other end of the spectrum is scientific misconduct. So not adhering to the standards. But there are three specific things that fall in true and clear scientific misconduct, and there's no disputing this. And that is fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism, otherwise known as FFP, at any stage of research. This can be at the point of drafting a proposal or coming up with a hypothesis, proposing a study, performing the study, conducting it, looking at the data, analyzing it, even reviewing research and the research of others, and in even the reporting of research results. So if you look at the full cycle of how research is done, from when you start off with a literature review, you identify a question, you put together a proposal, get it funded, do the work, analyze the data, and eventually report the results in any form. That could be an oral presentation, it could be a poster, it could be a manuscript. At every single stage of it, there is an expectation that there will be responsible conduct of research, and there will be no fabrication or falsification or plagiarism. Then there is, and perhaps we'll spend really the bulk of our time today talking about violations of the scientific standard. That is everything other than fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism. Because FFP falls very much in like a black and white zone, and it falls on the negative side, where you definitely do not, nobody wants to engage and should be engaging in fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism. But there's a variety of other things, other violations that are just questionable, may vary again from discipline to discipline, and institution to institution, even research group from one to the other. But these are really practices that we want to avoid, and that's why we're going to really talk about what they are, so we're all aware of them. So in research misconduct, coming back to FFP, fabrication is just the making up of data or results, right? So fabricating data out of thin air It is perhaps more common than we might imagine. And there are many reasons which we're not really going to unpack here about why people engage in research misconduct. But fabrication, which has happened across disciplines, across fields, is literally just making up data. It could be from manufacturing a Western blot to show protein expression when it didn't exist, or manufacturing out of thin air clinical data of a cohort of patients to make a particular point when it didn't actually exist. It's slightly different from falsification, and there is just as egregious. Fabrication is just as bad as falsification, but falsification is somewhat different because it is about, you have data, but it's playing around with it a little bit so that it is not an accurate representation anymore of the research record. So it's maybe manipulating the research materials. In some cases, when equipment is used to record data, altering it just slightly so that it zeroes down to something else, and maybe it skews the data a little bit. When we get graphs and we're inclined to maybe omit a data point or two because it doesn't give us a nice smooth curve, those would be the things that would be considered falsification of data. So the data is there, but it's being massaged or managed or handled in such a way that is falsifying the true record. And then plagiarism is something that I think all of you must already be familiar with. But plagiarism is the direct copying of anyone else's ideas or thoughts or written word without giving them due credit. And the credit part is important because I've said before that research doesn't happen in a vacuum. We do build upon the work of others. So it's not like we're not allowed to use it. It's just that we have to give due credit, and that due credit comes when we reference correctly and cite the work and give credit to the individual whose initial idea it was, or whose methodology we're using or building upon, or crediting just even in things like arguing for or against the evidence that we're generating. So those are the three things that are just a complete no-no: no fabrication, no falsification, and no plagiarism. And if you look at a spectrum of like kind of ideal behavior to worst behavior, this is what it looks like, with research, responsible conduct of research on the one extreme end, and the absolute worst behavior, which is unforgivable, being fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism on the other. And the reason that I say it's unforgivable is what we kind of talked about to begin with, because of the obligation that we have as researchers to the general public and to the research community. And when no one's watching, it's a responsibility we have to ourselves and the obligation we have to ourselves. But then what lies in the middle are these questionable research practices. And we'll spend some time just talking about what some of those might be, because the more we're aware of them, the more aware we are of our behavior when we conduct research, and we can be more mindful of things and common pitfalls that we may come across. Also, and this is an old study, it's almost 20 years old now. So this is a study that was published in Nature back in 2005. But this idea of engaging in any conduct that is not responsible conduct of research, whether it's questionable research practices or it's outright fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism, is not something that is limited to a particular geographic region or a particular discipline, or for that matter, a particular stage in career. It may often be considered, oh, you know, early career researchers just didn't know, or maybe there was a particular pressure on mid-career researchers to climb up the academic ladder or to get that next grant. So it actually, if you look at this and you look at everything from the first thing on the top 10 behaviors, which is falsifying or cooking research data, all the way down to other behaviors that would be considered more questionable, like inappropriately assigning authorship credit or withholding willfully the details of methodology or results in papers or proposals, is something that people around the world have admitted to, no matter what stage of the career they're in. And this was a study of more than 3,000 scientists. So it was pretty significant. And people did admit, for a variety of reasons, everything from ignorance to being pressured for various reasons, the people did admit to this kind of behavior. So it's something that we can easily fall into the trap of. And again, discussing it, being aware of it, reflecting on our own actions is always the way forward, so we can ensure that we don't fall into these kinds of pitfalls. And it comes really from the most prominent of researchers. So it's not even like the best out there, and by best, the ones who publish most prolifically, the ones who've had Nobel Prize wins. Everybody can kind of fall victim to this kind of behavior that will be considered not just questionable research practices, but outright research misconduct, with fabrication and falsification and plagiarism. So this example is from a researcher called Carlo Croce, who in the field that I work in, which is cancer, is very, very famous for the kind of work that he's done on microRNAs and otherwise. And there was plagiarism and data falsification that was identified in his lab at Ohio State University. A lot of it accredited to the fact that sometimes groups get so big and so busy that there isn't adequate oversight of actions of, let's say, these scientists who are working in his lab. Frances Arnold won the Nobel Prize for chemistry. She is at Caltech, and even she has had to retract a paper because there were allegations of misconduct. And in fact, these are some really interesting studies that show that it is the younger or more early career researchers that are holding the old guard to task by recognizing that ethical guidelines in many cases are not being followed by the more seniors or seasoned individuals in the field. So it really is the younger researchers who are calling to question the practices that prevail in a lot of fields. And physics happens to be one where there seems to be a lot of trouble that they're dealing with. So there are many other examples, but before we go forward again, I just want to pause for a second. Any thoughts or questions anyone has till now? Not seeing any, I think. I will check the chat though. Okay. So let's talk about a few of the things that might be considered questionable research practices. So aside from fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism, there's a lot that can happen with data. So it's not just about fabricating data, it's not just about falsifying data, and it's not just about plagiarizing someone else's data without giving due credit. There are other issues with data that we have to be very, very mindful of. And these include, very importantly, how data gets managed. So a lot of things that when people admit to committing acts that will be considered research misconduct, it really comes down to just sometimes mismanagement, a little bit of laziness, like I said, lack of oversight. And you can see how when we have a lot of data that's generated, whether it's in the form of the simplest forms, let's say, of paper-based surveys, or a electronic file in which data is being compiled, or really terabytes of data that is generated, let's say, from sequencing studies. Data is data, and it has to be dealt with confidentially. It has to be collected in a manner that is ensures that, of course, when you do things like patient data, you want to make sure that it is aligned with the individual whose data it is. In addition to confidentiality, you certainly don't want to get in a situation, and I don't know how many times this has actually happened, where in entering data into, let's say, an Excel file or an SPSS file or other things, you miss a row and you end up filling in data against a wrong patient record number, or a wrong or incorrect identifier. And you don't recognize it or realize it till much later. And then once it's happened, it's already too late. And it's really, really difficult to decode where that mistake was. And there is and so many people have given me examples of like, well, overall the data is correct. So what if it's just off by exactly which patient it goes with, right? But data collection, aside from confidentiality, how we collect it and how we record it is really, really important, because that is the true record, and that has to be maintained as such. So how we store data is really important, whether it's electronically or their physical files. And all of this would be considered if it's mismanaged, if it's stored in such a way that it can be, the confidentiality may be violated. That will be considered a very poor research practice, and therefore a questionable research practice that can call to question even the research integrity of the researcher. How data gets protected, and how data gets shared. So there's rules that govern. In some cases, the laws actually govern how we share data. We have things like data transfer agreements, even when we're sharing data across with our collaborators and collaborating institutions. But because data is so sensitive, because there can be everything from intellectual property rights to issues of confidentiality and anonymity, particularly in health records, it is really, really important that we are careful about how we manage data as far as collection is concerned, handling it is concerned, protecting it, and sharing it is concerned. There are several examples of any problems along the way. And remember, the unfortunate thing with questionable research practices is that intent, even for that matter with things like plagiarism, it's really hard to prove it after the fact. So you may have the best of intentions, but once these things happen, and it's really, really difficult to untangle, it can impact the research that's ongoing. But of course, it goes to credibility of researchers as well if this is not properly collected and handled. Another important thing which kind of governs all of this is who owns the data, and there's many different viewpoints about this. It is often considered that data tends to be institutional because there's institutional support and an infrastructure that goes into obtaining that data. But this is really, really questioned. In some cases, a granting agency may demand ownership of, or a donor agency may demand ownership of data. But I'd urge you to start thinking about who really owns the data, and what, especially if you're involved in research that with human subjects, and especially if they are patients, really who has rights and ownership of data. And if that ownership is violated, what could be some, obviously you can start thinking about what might be some lapses in research integrity that may then happen. The other thing, and I've given this example already when I've talked about publication practices, but there are many, many other things within publication practices and responsible authorship that would be considered questionable research practices. Some of these, like the first two, are very clearly still different forms of plagiarism. So I hope you're already aware of what plagiarism is, but to repeat myself, plagiarism is the copying of somebody else's ideas or methods or work or data, and trying to claim it without giving them due credit, as if it is yours and it is original. So within that, even duplicate publications, which is duplicating your own work and publishing the same thing in more than one place, which would be considered self-plagiarism, or duplicate publications is also a form of plagiarism. So that falls under FFP. Salami publishing or salami slicing, where we take research data and divide it up into the least publishable unit. And rather than publishing it as a whole, which is perhaps how it was meant to be when the objectives of the study were written, but rather splitting it up into very small publishable units, is also considered plagiarism and therefore falls under FFP. But then there's a whole host of other practices, some that we sometimes do unwillingly or unknowingly. that will be considered irresponsible publication practices or authorship. And those are things like too much self-citation, because more citations we have, the more it inflates some of these indices that show research productivity. Of course, when we cite, we have to cite correctly and most appropriately. In some cases, we do have to cite ourselves because that's how we avoid self-plagiarism. For example, if I'm using a method that I myself have optimized and I've written before and I've published about it before, it does make sense to cite myself, my own work. Or if I'm building upon work that I have previously published, it is required that I cite previous work done by myself or my group, but excessively to the point of doing it with the intent to inflate these indices would be considered an irresponsible act. In general, how we give authorship, who gets authorship, who is and in what order we give it is something that needs to be duly considered. It needs to be considered usually at the start of a study, not at the end. The important thing to remember with authorship is that whoever is an author has to not just take credit, but along with that good thing of taking credit, they also have to take responsibility and accountability. So everybody who goes on a paper has to know exactly what went into collecting that data, analyzing that data, and then interpreting it. So there are some very stringent criteria for authorship. Most journals will even ask for the contributions of each of the authors. In what order we put the authors, this is kind of can be dictated differently by different disciplines. But in medical and biological sciences, we have this idea of the first author being the one who's done kind of the most work, and having a senior author as the person who's the principal investigator. That's not always the case in social sciences, but making sure that everybody gets due credit, even in the order of authorship, is something that would be considered responsible conduct of research. And if we're giving undue authorships to individuals, so if my entire department starts putting my name on papers just because, I don't know, they're scared of me, or they feel like out of a favor that it would be nice to get my name on there, I don't deserve authorship in that case, and then putting me on there would definitely count for a questionable research practice. In today's day and age, with like open source publishing and other stuff, the accessibility of publications is hindered by who has open source access and others who don't. But generally in science, because we talk about the access, we talk about the responsibility and obligation from researcher to researcher within the scientific community. If somebody reaches out to me for access to my publication, and if I am able to share it, or if an author from, or a researcher from Nepal reaches out and says, oh, I read this paper and, you know, this is really interesting, and can you help me out by understanding it? Like, it takes a little bit of time, but giving that kind of accessibility would be considered on a really good research practice, because that's kind of the obligation that we have from one researcher to the other. This is something that's really unique to things like clinical trials and other stuff. And is an ethical consideration when there is information that it's about to be published. Of course, you know, you want to come out with a bang with that major science paper or that major Nature paper. But sometimes, is it required that there actually be early release of information, particularly if there might be the health and well-being of a patient that might be on the line, let's say in the case of, let's say, a clinical trial. So sometimes it is required that we breach some of the guidelines that are related to publication. One of the pitfalls that we really commonly fall into is this idea of predatory journals, the kind that reach out and ask you to publish with them. And there's a great story. I don't know how many of you have ever watched Seinfeld. But in Seinfeld, there is this, one of the characters in the show makes up a disease, a urological condition, because he needs to go to the bathroom so desperately, and he can't hold it, and he ends up going in a parking lot, and this cop finds him and books him, and he makes up this disease. And so there was a New Yorker author, this writer who's not a scientist, who took that exact same disease, which is totally made up, and wrote an entire case study on it because a predatory journal kept writing to him. And they published it, and they claimed it was peer reviewed. And he went back and he published in the New Yorker a whole series about, but it was made up, and the journal just refused. They insisted, no, we put this through peer review, and your work is good, and we're going to continue to publish it. Obviously, it's not, and we've got to be really, really careful, because this alters our credibility and can really impact it negatively. So as tempted as you might be, if you get someone who writes to you and says, "Oh, publish with us," this is really, really something that it would not be considered responsible authorship, and you need to look out for. Again, this is not a problem that's unique to, let's say, us here in Pakistan, or to our field, or lower middle income countries in general. Really, unearned authorships pervade science. They're all over. And if you look at US and Europe-based researchers, this is one of the things that keeps popping up when they think about questionable research practices. It really is a problem where authorships are gifted for favors and other things, and they're really not deserved. And so it's something that is a problem widely within the scientific community. You can well imagine that with artificial intelligence, the idea of it being used and listed as an author has already happened. And AI has been listed, so ChatGPT has been listed as a co-author in some papers already. I would almost argue that that's, at least there's acknowledgement of that, and there's, again, credit is being given where it's due. When there is lack of transparency in cases like this is a problem, and is going to probably get regulated really, really quickly if we're not able as a scientific community to regulate ourselves. Like, this will probably come down and might be a matter of major concern going forward. And so what that means when we have these kinds of questionable research practices is in publication, is that papers end up getting retracted. So in 2023, more than 10,000 research papers were retracted. That's a lot of man hours that went into reviewing papers, getting them published, people who read these papers and built their own research work on it, on the assumption that they were conducted with upholding the highest standards of research integrity. And when they're not, and these kinds of things happen, it really has a domino fallout effect. There are also some, yeah, go ahead, Rua. Go ahead. Did you have your hand up?
Yes, I did. So I just had this idea in my mind that, so the retraction number is obviously huge, right? But isn't retraction also happening because a lot of researchers are standing up for misconduct? So it's increasing transparency, and at the end of it, helping us maintain the same principles rather than think of it negatively.
No, it absolutely is, but it's also, so yes, with more awareness, more studies are being flagged and therefore being taken out of the research record. But the fact that they went in at all is also a matter of concern, right? So when you want to stop practices that are incorrect or harmful, you want to stop them at source, not once they've already been part of the research record. So I think it's excellent. And of course, that is, it is recognizing that we've become more aware of it, and therefore these things are being pulled out of the research record, but they shouldn't be there to begin with, right?
I agree.
And then just in the last few minutes, because many of you may actually be mentees or trainees, there is some standards that also have to be upheld in the advising and mentoring relationship. It's one of the ones that is often neglected, where there is a hierarchical structure of responsibilities rather than a shared responsibility of what does it mean for someone to be a supervisor or a mentor or an advisor, and what is their role in the relationship, and what are the roles and responsibilities of the mentee or trainee. We tend to ignore this with the assumption that the trainee does all the scut work, has to do, is kind of given orders and just has to comply. But like any other healthy relationship, for this to be a very successful relationship, there are responsibilities on both ends. So a mentor, a research mentor really needs to provide an enabling research environment. And there's a big difference between enabling and having oversight versus interfering. So interfering at the level of something that would prevent the growth of the mentee, or prevent the mentee from having their name in the correct order as far as authorship is concerned. And this is really a common problem that, hey, I brought the money in, my idea, you're just, low on the totem pole as far as somebody who was given, told what to do, and I get to be first author no matter what you've done. So those kinds of things is unfortunately really common practice, but this would totally come under a questionable research practice, because what kind of an enabling environment a mentor provides has to also, it is also linked to research integrity. One of the important things that mentors, particularly research mentors, are responsible for is transitioning members of their team to become independent researchers. So again, an enabling versus an interfering environment is really, really important here. And there's some responsibilities that come along with being a mentor rather than just taking all the credit for yourself. So allocation of credit, especially in publications, is really important. Again, when I do this and I talk about this with grad students, or when we have a little bit more time and we do this in a workshop format, there's some really interesting cases. So this one I'm recalling, there's a case of a grad student out of South America who was at this really major lab at Harvard. And how the relationship between him and his research supervisor, his principal investigator, soured so badly that the police had to be called in, and it just was such a disaster that this poor grad student didn't end up even completing his PhD. So of course that's like an extreme case, but there was so much reminiscent in that, that if we really reflect, we can identify in our relationships with our own research colleagues and mentors. And that's absolutely behaviors that we want to avoid, because it really needs to be about enabling and transitioning researchers to become independent. And then just a few things to wrap up. There are a few other matters of ethical concern specifically in research. Peer review is one of them. We rely on peer review to ensure that the research record remains spotless, but that's of course how we also catch things and retractions happen. But in that, then, because we're members of the scientific community and we expect others to review our papers, you kind of have to return the favor. At the expense of your time, you do have to peer review other people's papers, and you have to do it by meeting the deadline that's given, and really assessing quality, being free from any kind of bias, which can happen particularly if you end up reviewing within a certain field, because the person may actually be a competitor, and there's a race to get data out there. Or there may be data that you get to have access to as a reviewer that is confidential. It's not like I can take something from a paper that I've reviewed and start working on it on the side by myself without it being published. So there's a lot of things that come with the responsibilities of peer review, in addition to committing to it and doing it doing it fairly, just like you would expect for others to do for you. And because reviewing research can be sometimes a little bit of a subjective exercise, a lot of journals and a lot of research societies and discipline societies are coming together to actually putting guidelines together on who should be reviewing research and what kind of a checklist they have to follow. So it can become a lot more objective and be a lot more standardized. So this is just an example. You don't have to read through it, but just to show you from, let's say, the American Chemical Society, that really is about ensuring that reviews are free from bias, but they're fair and they look at quality and provide really sound arguments for the judgments that are presented. And some of these you guys might recognize. I think you've already mentioned this, but one of the reasons we have more retractions is because people are becoming more cognizant of these practices, and therefore there is an obligation to report whether it's happening after the fact, or if you unfortunately are seeing these kinds of behaviors of suspected misconduct, not from the perspective of a punitive action, but so that errors can be corrected beforehand, right? And this really goes to a movement within science, which is known as a kinder kind of science. So it's not always about punitive measures, but making sure that errors, if they are even being done sometimes unknowingly, remember, intent does matter, can be corrected before this information gets out, and reputations are ruined, and informations have, or papers have to be retracted, and so on and so forth. We should be careful about things like padding documents. We do it all the time with grant budgets because we assume that, either paise cut ke aayenge, so may as well ask for extra. But the reason that it gets cut is because it's become a vicious cycle, because granting agencies know that people ask for extra, and so they cut it, and then, we keep asking for more. So being true to all parts of the research cycle is really, really important. Padding your CV and putting in multiple references for the same activity. By the way, I've seen it being done just to inflate a resume would again be considered a questionable practice. And then lab safety, probably a little less relevant for the kind of work that you guys might do, but still, adhering to the standards of laboratory safety are just as important because it is an important part of biomedical research. And the last one I think here is citing fairly. And I want to link that to what we were talking with the responsible authorship practices. Just like it's unfair to oversight yourself, there is a trend that is seen where individuals or the work of researchers from the global south is not accurately credited and is not often cited. And there is, even though they may be the experts in it. So there's a huge movement within the research community to, when you cite, you actually cite the person who did the work, not just the review article that you got or you read, right? So you actually have to do a deep dive into figuring out who deserves the credit. So research misconduct actually has quantifiable economic costs. I sort of mentioned the reputational costs. I've also sort of talked about how, because we have this obligation within the research community and to society as well, that of course we want to avoid any kind of misconduct. But this was a study that was again done some time ago. This last author's name is somewhat unfortunate. It is not the president. It is another Donald Trump. But what they showed was, and they took like a smaller subset of studies, but there's actually an economic cost associated with retracting papers, or a much higher cost, like I was mentioning in this Alzheimer's field, where billions of dollars of funding have been given out, perhaps predicated on a very weak hypothesis because of some initial fabrication of data. So there's actually economic costs associated with it. Of course, there's time and effort and reputational costs as well. While punitive is perhaps not necessarily the way to go when you're trying to get people to adhere to ethical standards, there are examples of countries that are introducing punishments for scientific misconduct. And so these are social punishments. These go beyond losing your job. This could be, they have been extended so far as jail time. There's an example of the researcher who did the gene editing without approval in twins in China, and he served jail time for it. But there's further social punishments where individuals who have lost their jobs, lost their reputations, may also lose out on things like bank loans and their children getting into schools because of their scientific misconduct. And that's how seriously it's being taken in some places. So I will end there, and I'm happy to stay back and take questions. But if you read through this, and I'll leave it up, the ends do not justify the means, and we do have to be very, very mindful about ethical conduct in research. So thank you. I think I'm done.
we have questions in the chat that we had throughout the session.